Welcome to episode 5 of What We Believe. We are examining the doctrines and beliefs and practices of the Church of the Nazarene. And this is a good video series if you are a member of the Church of the Nazarene or wanting to become a member. But that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this series is I've come across many of my friends who are members of the Church of the Nazarene but do not know what the church believes and it's never been explained to them. And I also know there's many people that are just curious about what does the Church of Nazarene believe, and so we're going through right now. We're going through what's called the Articles of Faith, and we are on the fifth Article of Faith tonight. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. And not only are we looking at the Articles of Faith of what we believe according to the manual, which is this fancy little black book here, uh, but we're also examining it in the Scriptures because if it's not in the Bible it doesn't matter what we have to say on it. Does it really? Is it really? I mean, we got to be able to back it up scripturally, and especially when it's something we consider an article of faith, something that's important to being a believer in Jesus Christ and a follower of Christ. So that's why we're kind of studying this book. That's kind of what we're going through it. So tonight we're on the fifth article of faith. I'm going to read to you the manual statement. And you can feel free to look this up for yourself. Just type in Church of the Nazarene Manual in the Google search bar or the Bing search bar, whatever search engine you use. And there should be a free PDF file that you can click on and pull up. Or you can go to the Foundry Publishing House and purchase a copy of the manual for yourself. I think it's anywhere from $13 to $17, depending on what type of cover you want. Um, but again, you don't have to do that. There's a free version that's online. But I'm going to read to you what it says here. This is our fifth article of faith, which is got this big heading on here that says sin, original, and personal. So I'm going to read to you the manual statement. Then I'm going to kind of explain to you what it means in simple terms, and then we'll examine the scripture to see kind of how we formulate that belief structure. So this is what it says. It says, we believe that sin came into the world through the disobedience of our first parents and death by sin. We believe that sin is of two kinds: original sin or depravity, and actual or personal sin. We believe that original sin or depravity is that corruption in the nature of all the offspring of Adam, by reason of which everyone is very far gone from original righteousness, or the pure state of our first parents at the time of their creation, and is adverse to God, is without spiritual life, and inclined to evil, and that continually. We further believe that original sin continues to exist with new life of the regenerate until the heart is fully cleansed by the baptism with the Holy Spirit. We believe that original sin differs from actual sin in that it constitutes an inherited propensity to actual sin for which no one is accountable until its divinely provided remedy is neglected or rejected. We believe that actual personal sin is a voluntary violation of the known law of God by a morally responsible person. It is therefore not to be confused with involuntary and inescapable shortcomings, infirmities, faults, mistakes, failures, or other deviations from a standard of perfect conduct that are the residual effects of the fall. However, such innocent effects do not include attitudes or responses contrary to the Spirit of Christ, which may properly be called sins of the Spirit. We believe that personal sin is primarily and essentially a violation of the law of love, and that in relation to Christ, sin may be defined as unbelief. So basically, what we're saying is we believe that there's a thing called sin, right? We believe there's two different types of sin. When I say two different types, it's really more of they are the same thing, but there's two different ways we have to look at it. They're connected though. So the first one is actual sin, right? The actual sins are the things that we know are wrong. We know the things that we know God's Bible tells us not to do, and then we choose to do them anyway. We willfully make a decision to go against what we know to be a law of God. That is a sinful action. That is a sin that you have chose to commit. Um, Now, at the same time, we also believe that sin is original, or it's also what we call depravity. That means we as human beings, we are born sinful because of the first choice made by Adam and Eve. We're going to read that story together here in a minute. Well, we'll read the second part of that story here in a minute. Because tonight we're really focusing in on this idea of original sin. Because it's kind of, and the reason why we're going to do that is original sin is kind of what drives our passions. It's kind of what drives our way of thinking, and that's what leads to us making those sinful actions, right? You see, another way to explain it is personal sin is like if you're shooting a bow and arrow, right? And the goal, if you're shooting an arrow at a target, is you want to get a bullseye, right? You want the bullseye is hitting it directly in the middle. And anything short of that is to miss the mark, and that's essentially what sin is. Sin is missing the mark, and missing the mark of perfection that God has designed us for. Um, not per- yeah, but personal sin is knowing you're supposed to hit a bullseye and shooting the arrow and not miss. You don't miss because you're a terrible shot. You miss because you've decided that you don't want to shoot at the target. You want to turn around and shoot the rabbit behind you. That was an intentional, voluntary decision that you made on your own, a conscious decision, a willful action on your part to turn around and shoot something other than at the bullseye. Now, original sin is kind of continue with that analogy. Original sin is just missing because you're a terrible shot. There's something wrong with you. There's something that's wrong in your mechanics or your understanding of shooting or using the weapon. That is original sin in our lives. It's what's programmed us to naturally miss the mark of God, and that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. To the point, we as human beings, we're so broken. We're so sin has such an entanglement upon us when we're born that we don't even realize that we're supposed to be looking for Jesus. That's how lost we are. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, we would never come to a realization that we need Jesus in our lives. And again, we kind of get that from the book of Genesis. If you go to Genesis chapter 3, this is the story. It tells us the story of the fall. And really, the first 13 verses is telling the story of what happened, right? And most of us have heard it before. God creates man, and he decides it's not good for man to be by himself, and he puts the man whose name is Adam to sleep, and then and literally takes part of him and makes another person, right? An entire another person that's like him, but not, and that's the first woman, and her name is Eve, and they are meant to be partners in God's kingdom together, working together for the glory of God, and to the benefit of creation. Well, then they're in the garden, chapter 3, right? And God has told them, you can eat from any of the fruit trees in this garden I have you in. You can eat any of them you want, except for one. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you can probably guess, even if you don't know the story, you can kind of guess what happened. They decide to eat from the one tree. Understand something. God gave Adam and Eve that choice because love does not exist without choice. And God wanted humanity to have the freedom to choose to love him and choose to demonstrate that love to him by their obedience. Uh, Otherwise, if God didn't do that, he made us as robots. And robots are not as much fun as real people. Robots can be fun for a time, but anyway. So they're in the garden, and Adam and Eve they end up eating from the one tree, and that's the sin that enters the life. Their one sinful action corrupted the nature of all of humanity. Now they did have a little help, and most of you again that know the story, listen. No, there's a serpent here that's is referred to as Satan or the devil, and he kind of tempts Eve, right? And he kind of she says, well, hey, God said we shouldn't eat from this tree or we'll die. And the serpent's like, God, you won't really die. He kind of gets her to doubt the nature, the words of God. He kind of gets her to doubt the goodness of God, and that gets her to think that God is holding something back from her by telling her, God just told you not to do that because he knows if you eat from this tree, you'll become like him and you'll have the knowledge of good and evil. And she's thinking, I'll be like God. That's a cool thing, right? And that's kind of what entices her to make that choice. And then when she makes a choice, she gets Adam and says, hey, eat this, and he eats it too, right? Now, I mean, I really simplified that, but understand, Adam is just as guilty as Eve is because he didn't say no. He could have said no, but he didn't. And then there's this amazing showdown when after they eat from it, where Adam and Eve are hiding because they realized they were naked, right? And God confronts them, and he's like, hey, where you guys been at? And they're like, well, we were naked, God. We were afraid. We were embarrassed. And God's like, well, who told you you were naked? I didn't tell you that. And God's kind of onto them anyway, because God's all knowing and all powerful and all that stuff. And he already knew what happened, but he just wanted Adam and Eve to be truthful and confess to him what had happened. But they didn't do that because they were afraid of dying. They were afraid of the punishment that would come from being disobedient to God. And So they decided to take turns blaming each other. They played the blame game. They were trying to put fault upon the other person instead of just owning up to their mistakes. And it finally gets to the point where it gets to Eve, and she blames the serpent, and the blame game gets, you just keep this, the buck keeps getting passed, and that's we're going to pick up in verse 14 tonight. And this is God administering justice because of the sin that was committed. And this is where we see the effects of original sin in our midst even today. And this is kind of the curse that sin brought upon humanity. And understand this: sin brought this curse upon us. God didn't bring this curse. Sin brought these consequences upon us. All right, sin is the problem. All right. So in verse 14 it says, God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Now, one thing that's kind of cool in this passage is that the serpent, again, represents the devil or Satan, and it's telling us that as long as there is humanity on the planet, there is going to be strife between you and them. This is not talking about women are going to be afraid of snakes, because if you really ask around, there are just as many men afraid of snakes as women. That's not that, that's really taking at a super literal understanding of this passage here in Genesis 3 verse 14 and 15. But what's really after is here, there is going to be a battle between you and the offspring of Adam and Eve. Now, the ones that want to do good and pleasing things to God are going to struggle because of the devil and the existence of evil in the world. There is going to be constant conflict because of it. And even taking a step further, this is also a prophecy of the coming of Jesus. It says, I put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. He's literally telling Satan, hey, just know you may have caused him to sin here, but one day one's going to come who is formed in the same way as Adam, without a sinful nature, and without that original sin that bends them toward broken and making broken choices, and he is going to completely and utterly destroy your kingdom. You will, and so if you study the story of Jesus, right, Jesus does die on the cross, but then he rises again, and that provides for the forgiveness of sins once and for all, and that includes the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, and also the original sin that we're talking about today. All right, let's move on to verse 16. Verse 16 says, to the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing, and pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Again, it's important to point out to you that these what God is describing here in Genesis verses 14 through verse 19 is the consequences of sin. This is the curse of sin. This is not the way God designed it. This was not God's plan. That means it is not God's will. What's being described in these verses, this is the effects of sin upon humanity. This is the sinful nature. This is depravity at work in humanity and creation. And so in 16 it says, to the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing, and pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This is talking about all the struggles that women will have to endure because of depravity. When it talks about your desire shall be for your husband, he shall rule over you, that is not a good thing. That was not God's plan. That was not God's will. Remember, if you look in Genesis 2, God created them to be helpers for one another, to oversee creation. But here, we see a curse of sin creates a hierarchy where men are going to dominate over women. And you see that playing out throughout all of human history, right? It isn't until recently that women have been considered more than property, right? Back in biblical times and throughout most of history, women have been considered property of their husband, or a commodity to be traded for favors, right? If kings wanted to make a deal, what they do? They traded their daughter off in marriage to another country. Again, that's treating them like property. That is laid out here in the book of Genesis as a symptom of the depravity of humanity because of sin. The pains in childbirth, same thing. But also at the same time, too, there's a bit of foreshadowing of the church in this passage, too. Because of sin in this world, both original and and the sinful action and actual sin, uh, it makes sharing the gospel and bringing people to the knowledge of Jesus difficult as well. Because we are so broken and corrupt. Again, I said at the beginning, we don't know that we're supposed to contain Jesus in our lives. But yet, when you become a follower of Jesus Christ, you're sent out to go make disciples in the midst of this broken, messed up world. But again, understand this. When you're reading 16, verse 16 here, understand it's not the will of God here, it's the curse. And it's important for us to differentiate that, because there are so many that try and build understanding of marriage and life based on the curse here. But God, when you're saved through the blood of Jesus Christ, you are no longer under the curse. You are under grace. And what's grace trying to do? Grace is trying to restore you back to what God originally intended for us as part of creation. All right? So when you read verse 16, understand this. This idea of a husband's ruling over their wives, and wives, you having to submit and have your husband as your authority figure, that is not of God. That's not a biblical thing. That is a side effect of the fall of sin. That's depravity at work, and something that we can tangibly see. And we can still see that in our world today. There's still a struggle happening, trying to fight for equality. And somebody's calling me. All right, let's continue on. Verse 17. So God continues handing out his curses. And he says, to the man, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust. All right, there's two bits of this that reveal to us the sinful nature at work in humanity. And regardless of genders, it doesn't really matter which way you look at it. It still kind of applies. But I am going to take it a step further to address guys specifically in a second. But I'm going to start off by talking about how, understand this, when God created humanity, when he put us to work in the garden, it wasn't for our survival. God had already provided everything that we needed to survive and to live happily ever after. It wasn't until after the fall we actually had to work to survive. We had to learn to farm. We had to learn to hunt. We had to learn to do all these things just to struggle for an existence. We were not designed to struggle to exist. We were designed to be dependent upon God for our survival. It is the curse of sin that causes us to think that we have to follow the survival of the fittest and be the strongest to survive and to make it, and to work hard to get what we have, right? And we have to earn every cent that we get. But understand something, that's not the way God designed us. That's a side effect of the sinful nature. And the reason why I said I want to talk to guys for a minute, because as men, especially in society, we see this side effect of depravity playing out. It's, if we aren't out providing for our families, if we aren't the major breadwinners, and if we aren't the major authority figure of our household, we think we're falling short. We think we're not measuring up enough to be a man. But understand something. God designed you to be dependent upon him and to trust him with your life, trust him with your family. So those feelings you're feeling of inadequacy and of failure, those aren't of God. Those are a side effect of the sinful nature at work inside of you and in society, putting pressure upon you. God created us to be dependent upon him. And again, those are just glaring side effects of original sin that we see playing out right here in the text. You go into chapter 4, we see that hatred becomes a side effect of sinful nature, and the desire of competition, and if we aren't the one on top, then we're gonna do whatever it takes to get rid of the one that's preventing us from being the one on top, right? And we see throughout the study of scriptures and in our own world the effects of the curse of sin playing out in greed and lust and perversion, all these different things that the Bible will later on mention as sins, right? Again, the reason why the sin tells us the Bible tells us what's wrong, and we know what's wrong to commit them, but really the law of God was just simply given to us to point out how broken and far short we fall of the righteousness of God. Because in reality, that's the measuring stick for us. We cannot determine how successful and how good we are by measuring ourselves against other sinners. The only way we can determine how good we are is by measuring ourselves against the righteousness of God. And we measure ourselves by the righteousness of God. Every single one of us falls short, and that reveals the nature of sin and that original sin that resides in every single one of us. But the good news is this, and I know that we haven't gotten there yet, but we'll discuss it later. But I hate to leave a video on a note like that and let sin and evil have the final word. The good news is this: that Jesus died on the cross for the forgiveness of all sin. That includes your sinful actions, but that also includes your sinful nature. All right, well, that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them to me, post them in the comments, and we'll see you next time.